Hello, and welcome to this week of the Story of Christianity. This week we're going to be looking at the events that took place in European intellectual history in the 16th and 17th century, often called the Enlightenment. In this period, many ideas and movements came about that fundamentally shifted the nature of European and American intellectual culture, and from there affected most of the globe. So we're going to be looking into these ideas and how they contributed to the modern world, and especially how did Christianity attempt to relate to them. So we're going to be looking at several things. We'll begin with the 17th century and look at the rise of modern science and how this changed the worldview of many Europeans. We'll look at several philosophical trends that contributed to this growing understanding known as the Enlightenment. We'll then move on to the 18th century and look at how these earlier ideas developed within the intellectual culture to challenge certain forms of Christianity in search of what was understood as a rational faith as opposed to a revealed faith. We'll look at the idea of deism, we'll look at the arguments against miracles, and the new view of human nature that emerged. In order to see how these ideas kind of took shape and had legs in the real world, we'll briefly discuss the French Revolution and how this event symbolizes the end of Christendom. We'll also then briefly look at some of the most influential responses to this movement, specifically the birth of liberal theology from the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Before we begin, I'd like to discuss what we even mean by the term enlightenment. In order to understand this, we have to think about a term called historical periodization. Now, throughout this term, we've used various ideas of history, so like the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation. And we can sometimes mistakenly think of these ideas as occurring in this linear narrative in which one follows the other. In this traditional simplification, we have the classical history of Greece and Rome, followed by the Middle Ages, followed by the Enlightenment, followed by the Renaissance, the Reformation, then an era of Enlightenment, modernity, and perhaps postmodernity. However, as much as this might have some utility, it is a vast oversimplification. This presentation of ideas often makes one think that these were self-contained, that the Renaissance occurred before the Enlightenment, or the Renaissance occurred before the Reformation occurred after the Renaissance, although these ideas were completely mixed together. It's the same thing with the Enlightenment. It is not a discrete unit of time. So we have to understand a much more complex narrative. So when we speak of the Enlightenment or any period of history, we're really just using a shorthand tool to describe a series of events that have some sort of unified theme or content to them. It is not as if there is a set date for the Enlightenment to begin and end, just as there isn't really for periods such as the Reformation, etc. So if you see the different angle that I presented above, we see that these various movements, these various trends, these various series of events overlapped in multiple ways. And this is very important so we don't get a skewed understanding of history. So, for instance, when you read many works on the history of Christianity that discuss the Enlightenment, it acts as if this is a unified series without any real response from the church. Most of the works that discuss Christianity, especially in the 18th century, seem to neglect most of the trends going on within the church itself, focusing on philosophical systems and trends. Now, we're going to be doing that today because that's an important narrative to understand. However, at the same time, we need to know that these events are happening at the same time as Protestant orthodoxy, with many theologians working and continuing on the teachings of the Reformation at the time. And these are not marginal figures, but have major positions at the great universities throughout the world. And that what we discussed last week, the First Great Awakening, is actually happening at the same time as the Enlightenment, and in some ways is responding to similar themes. The questions of what does it mean to be Christian in this new world? What is freedom? What is the proper response to the increased poverty and uncertainty of the world? And so when we talk about these ideas, we need to understand that they're always interrelating with other trends going on. So as I speak about the Enlightenment, don't forget that this is going on alongside other movements that we've discussed, such as Protestant orthodoxy and the rise of pietism and revivalism. What I want us to understand is when we talk about periods of history, these are not airtight categories. These are collective movements and trends that have a complex relationship. And they're not just one thing. For instance, most contemporary discussions of the Enlightenment realize that it is not a single unified movement, but with many different trends based on different regions, different philosophical thinkers, and that the narrative is just much more complex than we normally take account of. However, in a class such as this, we must do the best we can to give a overarching, simple narrative that we can grasp. And so I do want to avoid, though, two simplistic narratives about the Enlightenment. And one is generally presented as the more secular narrative, that the Enlightenment is the source of all good in the modern world. It casts aside all understandings of superstition and brought human freedom to all. This is a much too simplistic understanding of what the Enlightenment is doing, and it's actually funding modern attempts to promote a certain philosophy more than a historical account of the Enlightenment itself. But we also don't want to fall into the simplistic narrative that can often be presented by Christians, such that the Enlightenment is the source of all evils in our modern world. It is the root of all secularization and all movements away from Christianity. So in this narrative, the Enlightenment itself causes the alienation of humanity from God and each other. Now, while both of these narratives, the good of the Enlightenment and the evils produced by the Enlightenment, have rings of truth to them, the narrative is much more complex. Many Christian figures could be considered Enlightenment thinkers if we tweak the definition slightly. For instance, Jonathan Edwards was very influenced by many of these themes, although he's often left out of narratives of the Enlightenment entirely. As we saw with John and Charles Wesley, they are both working from a engagement with Enlightenment thought. In fact, John Wesley even wrote tracts in science and medicine, etc., that were very much influenced by Enlightenment thinking. So as we go through this narrative, keep these two simplistic narratives out of our mind as we try to develop a more complex understanding of the Enlightenment and its importance for the modern day. All right, so if we're going to begin, what do we mean when we talk about the Enlightenment? In order to understand this, I think the best place to begin is a statement that tried to answer this question at the end of the 18th century. During this period, there was much discussion of enlightenment, of bringing in this new experience into the world. And Immanuel Kant, who is probably one of the most significant philosophers of the 18th and into the 19th century, gives a definition of enlightenment in an essay he wrote simply entitled, "What is Enlightenment?" We're not going to talk about Kant much today, but I would recommend he's very important to understand the intellectual history of Europe. But when asked what is enlightenment, this is what Kant said. Enlightenment is man's emerging from his self-inured immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolve and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of the Enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, that is, dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding. In this, we really do see the heart of the Enlightenment project, this daring to know, this moving beyond received knowledge, beyond tradition, and daring to view the world in a different way. We'll see throughout that some of these movements are very good and very profitable to humanity, but it does undercut much of the worldview of pre-modern people, the reliance on authority, the union of a community, the kind of authority of traditional ways of life. And it will open up the floodgates for many different things. So when we think of the Enlightenment, we have to think that this is a movement of knowledge. What does it mean to know? But also we notice this discussion of immaturity. The Enlightenment can often claim that all humans before the Enlightenment and all those who may oppose facets of the Enlightenment are working out of an immature understanding of what it means to be in the world. We see here a certain arrogance, a certain chauvinism of understanding that the Enlightenment is the only way to grasp truth. And we'll see some of those trends emerge as we go. But I think this is our helpful understanding. Those who pursued the Enlightenment thought that they were perpetuating the maturation of human beings. And that meant leaving aside much of what the world had traditionally known. So let's briefly discuss some of the areas of Enlightenment thought before we work out how they emerged historically. So one of the first and main features of Enlightenment thought is confidence in the capacity of human reason to discern the true nature of reality. This tendency is often called rationalism. Human beings have the ability to know the world without any reliance on anything other than their thinking minds, that the human mind is capable and able to know true reality by itself. This quest for a rational world is also tied with a quest for certainty based on human reason and an investigation and experience. So we have both an emphasis on human thought and reason and experience of the world. This is good in many ways. It leads to advances in science and experimental work, but it also puts not just the ability of human knowledge to know the world, but certainty then is restricted to that which can be proved by reason or by sense experience. We'll see that there's actually tensions between these two. We won't go into it much, but you can see how if truth comes through reason or experience, there might be a tension. What about when reason and experience seem to differ? Okay. These tendencies then result in viewing the world itself and nature as self-existing and self-contained whole. Therefore, the view of the actual world shifts from the theater of God's glory, in which has a specific end towards the glory of God and the flourishing of human beings, into almost a mechanical view, in which we have nothing but cause and effect and atoms in motion. This will deeply affect kind of understandings of one's place in the world as well. This leads to the importance of the individual over and against tradition, nation, family. So it's the individual's mind. This is what Kant was getting at. You need to dare to know and use your own reasoning and not submit to the thought of any other. To do so is merely immaturity. These movements lead to a rejection or a renewal of inherited social structures and hierarchies. This is across all facets of human life. Political upheaval, economic rethinking. It's at this time that we have both the early emergence of ideas such as capitalism and early forms of communism or socialism. And there is also the rejection of church hierarchy, church and ecclesial structures that become relegated as unimportant, which what is important is one's own understanding, one's own ability. And this leads further then to growth in ideas about deism, a distant God who does not really have an interaction with the mechanical world, and focuses on natural theology, the attempt to know God apart from revealed religion. So we're going to look at all these different trends within Enlightenment thought today, tracing out how they developed and some of the significant figures who contributed to them. I do want to note, though, that even at this moment, as you look and think about this list, you realize that many of these trends are still very much with us today and have influenced our thought, often without our knowing it. Although we're going to go through many figures today that you maybe never even heard of, it is quite likely that some of your own thought, or even the thought of those around you, have been tacitly influenced by these ideas without ever having heard of their originator or ever having read the works. These ideas have really seeped into our culture in various ways and have been shaped over the historical period. But so in understanding the Enlightenment, one of our goals is to understand not just what occurred in the past, but to understand in some ways our own world once again. So let's begin with the 17th century and what I'm calling a search for a rational world. The 17th century saw for the first time the separation of philosophy and natural science from theology. In the Middle Ages and even in the early modern period, these things were intricately interconnected. Theology and philosophy worked together. One could not really do one without the other. And natural science was not really fully developed. This is not to say, very clearly, that the Middle Ages or the early modern period did not have many advances in scientific understanding. It certainly did. But this was seen as actually a branch of philosophy and in some ways a branch of theology to understand the creation itself. As we emerge into the 17th century, European thinkers thought to explain the world more in terms of human reason and observation. We generally call this the rise of the scientific method, primarily through the work of a man named Francis Bacon. These 17th century figures, it should be noted, were not on the whole anti-religious. Yet many of the ideas that were proposed in the 17th century would lay the groundwork for later anti-religious thought. So, in order to understand this, let's begin with what we call the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution is separable from the Enlightenment, moving from different impulses and kind of a different strand of history. However, it is very influential on the shifting of European intellectual understanding in this period. So the first thing we need to look at is the rise of the scientific method. There's a movement away from understanding the natural world, first by theorizing, and then, so basically armchair science. thinking about how the world ought to be based on human reason. There's a shift to experimental science, having a hypothesis that is then checked against the sense data of the world. This leads to many great advances in vast realms of knowledge of the natural world that will continue up through the 19th century and even today in many ways. But this change in scientific method leads to a fundamental revolution in the understanding of the world itself, which we can describe as a move from an Aristotelian world to a Newtonian Copernican world. Okay? So in the Middle Ages and through most of the ancient period, the world is understood fundamentally as a hierarchy of being. So we have the lower beings of inanimate objects, then we have plants, we have animals, we have human beings who are simultaneously earthly, having bodies, and yet having an intellect that reaches above. We then have immaterial beings such as angels, and above that and beyond completely the whole chain of being is God. This kind of philosophically and metaphysically constructed view of the world also applied to what one understood about the physical world itself. The Earth was understood as stationary and at the center of the universe, and ascending above it, we had various crystalline spheres in which the stars remained set. Okay, so we have this kind of hierarchy moving up ultimately to God. The world above the Earth was seen as unchanging, and the point of this was to understand the glory of God. So the entire world was teleologically or directed towards an end, and that end was the glory of God. The Aristotelian worldview begins to break down through various observations of astronomy, specifically the ideas of Copernicus, who posited rather than the Earth being the center in which the sun rotates around, we have the sun in the center of the solar system and the Earth moving around. This was done through the recognition that the orbits of many of the planets especially did not move in the way that one would expect if the Earth was the center of the universe, and was further supported by the work of people like Galileo and Kepler, who were able to back up these scientific claims with observation. Now, you might know that in some ways these ideas were pushed back against by the church, especially in the famous trial of Galileo. However, what we need to understand about this is these weren't really theological issues. These were primarily two different scientific paradigms, that of Aristotelianism and this new Copernican and later Newtonian world coming into conflict. So while there were religious implications for this, it was not fundamentally new. One of the other main things that changed this, though, is the idea of modern physics that we see principally in the work of Isaac Newton and his famous Principia Mathematica in 1687. In this, Newton is able to describe the motion of the material world in unchanging laws. So he's able to mathematically show how objects will move, and this fundamentally changes one's understanding of the world. In this, the world is now able to be seen as the self-contained element of cause and effect, of motion, of matter in motion. And this moves from an understanding. So you might wonder, how does all this affect one's understanding of the world? Does it really matter if the Earth is the center of the universe or the sun is? In some ways, it really doesn't, and that didn't really cause much chaos, in fact. But this new view of the world as open, as changeable, as rationally understandable, just changed the kind of the theater in which people lived. It moved from being understood as creation, this teleologically constructed reality, movement towards God, into nature, or something that is, as we can see, opposed to the supernatural. Okay? And this changed human perception. Now, it should be stressed that this was not Newton's intent, in fact. Newton himself was quite religious and even mystic in his work. And beyond his work in mathematics and physics, he also wrote commentaries on the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. He was quite interested in especially calculating the end of days. Now, while Newton probably was not what we would call an Orthodox Christian, he did not see any contradiction between the activity of God, even prophecy, and the future world with his science. However, later figures would. So our first change that happens in the 17th century is the shift to a new view of nature based on Newtonian science. Okay? We also need to see two philosophical trends that contributed to the reorientation of the European mind. The first of which we call rationalism. And rationalism is the idea that the only way to have true knowledge is to begin with propositions that in no way can be doubted. This was primarily brought about by the philosopher Rene Descartes, who was a Frenchman but worked primarily in the Netherlands. So in this idea, if we're asking how can we know something for sure, Descartes and other rationalists say it is only by human thought and reason that this can be done. But reason here is explained in a very particular way. It's not as if pre-modern people did not think about reason. Reason was a faculty in which one ordered what was known about the world through eyewitness testimony passed down and rational thought. But Descartes began with a different perspective. Reason began with doubt for Descartes. So with Descartes trying to find out what can I know is true beyond all possible doubt, he says, I'm going to begin by doubting everything that is possible to doubt in any way. And as he weeds down all possible knowledge, he gets to one truth that he cannot doubt, and that is, I think. So in the process of doubting, one thing that must be sure is that there is a thinking going on, even in the doubting, and that cannot be doubted because it would prove itself. So if there is doubting, there is thinking. If there is thinking, there is an I who thinks. And if there is an I who thinks, therefore, I must exist. Okay, so this is the basis of Descartes' philosophy, that this is the one completely undoubtable truth, that I exist because I am thinking. Any certainty of knowledge must then be built on these sort of ideas that are indubitable, unable to be doubted. So Descartes moves from this idea of I think, therefore I am, to create other axioms that must be absolutely true, and then build a system of rational philosophy based upon this. One of the main outworkings of this is reason becomes autonomous from tradition in every way. That it is possible for the rationalists to move away from even the external world, from what anyone has ever said before, to think their way to the truth about reality itself. And that is how one finds certainty. So this will be a revolution in philosophical understanding. This principle of methodological doubt will be very influential. And Descartes' philosophy, his physics, his understanding of religion itself will be extremely influential throughout the 17th century. Now, once again, I must note that Descartes' thought is not in itself innately anti-religious. In fact, as he moves from indubitable principles, from I think, therefore I am, God is actually the third step from his development of axioms, and he remains a faithful member of the Catholic Church throughout his life. However, once again, this principle of doubt calls into question the authority of the Church and later the authority of Scripture. So while Descartes does not take it to this point and still affirms the deity, the presence of the deity and his revelation in the Word of God, others will take his ideas in more radical directions. Another philosophical change that must be accounted for is the idea of empiricism. If the rationalists find certainty in their thinking, the empiricist finds certainty in observation of the external world. Certainty comes not from abstract reasoning, as Descartes, but from the analysis of the world of your senses. So we can know the truth by experiencing it, and all certainty must be based on observable and explainable sense perception. One of the main figures attributed for popularizing this philosophy, although he's definitely not the only one, is the English philosopher and political theorist John Locke. John Locke redirected human knowledge from speculation about things unseen, which would include all metaphysics, all religious things, and wanted to point one's attention to the world, and that which was presented from our senses, our sight, our taste, our touch, and what we could enhance those senses with certain apparatus, such as microscopes, telescopes, etc. We see how this works out of, in some ways, this new Newtonian model and the previous thought of Francis Bacon in this scientific method. Certainty comes by not abstractly thinking, deducing from first principles, but from observing all the facts in the world and creating a theory to explain the facts, as opposed to a theory that then produces facts, as Descartes in some ways has. Simplistically stated, and let me stress, simplistically stated, but empiricism can seem to be, we know because we can see. So this likewise helps people do things in the modern world. So reason and experience can be applied to the proper ordering of society. This bears a lot of fruit in Locke's thought, especially in political theology. He's one of the originators of social contract theory. His ideas will be very influential in the American Revolution, as well as his calls for religious toleration, which come out of some of these empirical moves. But once again, I want to stress that the 16th century figure was not opposed to religion in his thought. And in fact, he gives us several categories to understand how reason can function with reference to the world. He gives us three categories. Something can be according to reason, it can be above reason, or it can be contrary to reason. This is what he says. According to reason are such propositions whose truth we can discover by examining and tracing those ideas we have from sensation and reflection, and by natural deduction, find to be true or probable. So, what is according to reason is that which comes about from our sensation and our reflections upon the facts of the world that we deduce, so we move from discrete facts into theorizing, and we find to be true or probable. So any of these things can be accord with human reason, which is fundamentally produced by the ordering of sense perception. However, Locke also allows a category of something being above reason. And he says these are such propositions whose truth or probability we cannot by reason derive from those principles. Okay, so he says there are truths that are above reason that we cannot derive purely from reflection on the sensual world. Okay, we'll talk about what he means by that in a second. But there are a third category of those things contrary to reason. These are such propositions as are inconsistent with or irreconcilable to our clear and distinct ideas. So if we establish a set of ideas according to reason, anything that goes against those ideas must be rejected as contrary to reason. He applies this to broader ideas by saying, thus the existence of one God is according to reason, the existence of more than one God is contrary to reason, and the resurrection of the body after death is above reason. Now we need to think about why he says this. According to his understanding, you could think back to Aquinas' five proofs, the existence of a single God is according to reason because of these cosmological arguments. In fact, Newtonian physics, for most of its thinkers, required a mind behind the world to explain the rationality that we see and the predictability that we see within nature. And so the existence of a God for Locke was very much in line with our experience of sense perception. There is a world and we can move from that to an origination of the world. If one God is according to reason, then multiple gods would be contrary to reason, that there would be no necessary principle for something like a polytheism. But notice what he puts above reason. The resurrection of the body after death is above reason. So why might this be? How can we prove this? How can, the question comes, how can Locke actually determine what itself is above reason? Primarily, this is because the resurrection of the body is a future hope. It is not, by definition, accessible to human sense perception. We can trust it, according to Locke, because of the authority of Scripture, which was less for him, but he connected it very much to the authentication of prophecy and miracles. We'll come back to that idea later. But the resurrection of the body is something that is above and beyond reason. Okay? So these three categories, while at first blush are not bad, there's actually something very helpful with them. In certain ways, Locke uses them to subordinate revelation to human autonomous reason. So it has always been a tradition within the church that the truths of revelation and the truths of the world can never be in contradiction because all truth comes from God, all truth is unified. But that's easy to say, but what does that mean when there's apparent contradictions? What Locke's attempt does is it actually elevates the human reasoning capacity above the revealed truth, and therefore allows the possibility that things that were considered revelation are actually contrary to reason in our sense perception. Okay? So this is the measuring of the truth of revelation, in whether it accords with our reason and experience or not. And again, while Locke himself would not move into an anti-religious position, some of these ideas led him to either Unitarianism or Arianism. Locke's actual personal position is very hard to discern. But these various trends of the rise of modern science, the rise of rationalism and empiricism have a very profound effect on the way Europeans begin to think about the world, how they used to begin to think about the nature of society, and how they began to think about the nature of religion. 2 points I want to point out that already come about in this early 17th century period. And this is a tendency towards anti-supernaturalism, or we could put it more simply as naturalism. If the world is a self-contained series of cause and effect, understood by unalterable natural laws, then what place does God have in the world? Is it possible that God is just the one who begins the world and the series of cause and effect and then has nothing more to do with it? This leads to understandings that the only thing that is knowable is that which we can experience and sense. So anything that is beyond our perception of the world, accessible to reason and sense perception, becomes in some ways less true. And this will lead to a later development in which the only thing that exists are matter in motion. There is nothing beyond that. And this will be a large foundation of later Enlightenment thought. We also see, and we could take this back to Kant's initial statement, we see here a rejection of authority. There is a growing rejection of the authority of the church and the authority of revelation. Now, these early thinkers didn't really push that, but you can see how their ideas, if the only way to move to certainty is through reason and sense perception, the authority that's vested in the church to speak forth the truth of God, or the authority of revelation itself, which is an element within the created world, could be undercut. And human authority, or human autonomy and human reason are risen above the authority of the church and the scriptures. So these will have quite a few effects in the later world, and you can still see them very much present in our world. Okay, so the ideas proposed by the 17th century would be further elaborated on in the following century, and in some sense taken to their natural conclusions. For instance, if reason and experience are the means of certainty, then why have any category which is above reason at all? Later thinkers will look at Locke and other similar figures who gave a place to what we would call mystery, to ideas that are beyond human capacity to know and yet are true based on revelation, such as the doctrine of the incarnation, the Trinity, of redemption itself, original sin. And they would say we don't need a category for above reason. There is only that which is reasonable, either produced from indubitable first principles or from sense perception, and those which are contrary to it, including much of the religious idea. So in the 18th century, we have a group of intellectuals who attempt to find a modern rational faith within the modern rational world produced by these earlier thinkers. These ideas would affect many parts of Christian thought, such as our understanding of God, the possibility of miracles, the view of human nature, and the very nature of what religion is itself. So we're going to move through these and begin to build a picture of what did the Enlightenment thought do to certain forms of Christianity. To begin with, these ideas would affect the understanding of who God is, and this would give rise to a religious movement known as deism. Deism held to God as creator of the world, who does not interfere or continue to speak except through reason and experience. So in this you can see a removal of any special revelation, that is, God speaking in time to human persons, and a reliance purely on general revelation, or the kind of knowledge of God that is accessible through reflection upon the natural world. This is necessary for most of these deists because the Newtonian model did necessitate something like a divine mind behind the world to explain its complex nature. And later Christian apologists will work off these ideas to still affirm a notion of God. However, there's a problem here. What is to ensure that the God who created the world and the God we see presented in revealed revelation are the same? If the world itself is just matter in motion, if there are universal, unalterable laws that govern the world, how is it that a God could act within this world in such a way that would not violate his own law? And therefore, deism pushes back on this and affirms the existence of a God who is in some ways less than personal, who begins the world and then lets it go on. Sometimes this is compared to a clockmaker God who creates the world, winds it up, and lets cause and effect go. So in this, deism affirms that all religious truth must be based on reason or in accordance with reason. This becomes particularly prominent in England and France, but I'm only going to look at one of the English deists known as Matthew Tyndall. He writes a work that's attempting to respond to Locke in some ways, which is that Christianity is old as creation. So what he's arguing here is, what is the truth of Christianity? The essence of Christianity is just natural religion. Okay, this natural religion is accessible to all people. It is not dependent on any special historical circumstance, therefore no covenant necessary, no incarnation necessary. But Christianity is, if it is the true religion according to Tyndall, and he, it should be noted, he was a bishop within the Church of England at the time. So this deist perspective would hold that Christianity is just natural religion, and this is what this natural religion consists in. There exists a creator, which we can observe from the natural world. This creator is to be worshipped. This can be discerned because if there is such a being who created the world, one does have some sort of allegiance to him as the creator. But worship here looks like ethical and moral action. So this creator who's made the world must be good, and therefore we worship him by likewise being good. How do we know how to be good? Do we have to rely on revelation? The answer is no. This can be understood through reason as well. So there's a tying of natural religion with concepts of natural law. And all of the supernatural elements of Christianity are removed as later obfuscations or kind of pedagogical movements to this higher form of religion known as deism. Thus, for the deists, revelation is nothing other than what appears in natural religion, which is discernible by reason. Any feature of religion that goes beyond the existence of God and is not conducive to morality is therefore superstition. This would include the Trinity, incarnation, atonement, justification, sacraments, etc. So deism pares down Christianity to what it sees as its essential elements. However, it, in so doing, removes all the essential elements that we see presented in the New Testament for a more rational religion by their understanding, but one that really struggles to deal with the fundamental problems that we see Christianity present. So deism will be a very influential philosophy amongst the intellectuals of the late 16th and through most of the 18th century. And many of the founding fathers of the United States would have professed some sort of deism. And this does seem to be one of the default understandings of God within our world today. A God who is not involved with the everyday life, who merely winds up the world and goes away, and who does not demand of us anything other than which we can understand on our own. Okay, so deism becomes a very influential force within the 18th century. These ideas are also perpetuated by attacks against the questions of the miraculous. You recall that Locke supported many of his ideas of that which is above reason by appeal to both miracles and revealed prophecy. However, others would drastically attack these ideas. They thought that the principles of Newtonian physics could indicate to many of these people that miracles could not even occur, since this would be a violation of the laws of nature. If we have some sort of deist view of God, in which he has set up the world to run by laws and secondary causation and then does not interfere, any miracle would be a violation of that, and we could not use it for support. So we saw that Locke did not take this course, but supported his ideas by it, that prophecy and miracles were possible. However, there was a very sharp attack against these ideas by Scottish philosopher David Hume, who probably supported some extreme view of deism, although it's hard to say. Hume argued that a miracle could only be known through historical testimony, and that this could never be sufficient to prove a miracle. So Hume here is working on an empiricist mode. In fact, Hume would take his empiricism very far and end up in a form of skepticism about much of the world. But he argues that the only way we can know a miracle would occur is if people tell us about it. And a miracle is such an extraordinary thing that the evidence for it would have to be so extraordinary as to almost be miraculous itself. So he says that there is no amount of testimony that could ever be put forth for a miracle to be affirmed. Okay. He also works this out in the laws of nature. Okay. Let's see how he does so. So this is what Hume says. Since nature operates on unchanging laws, there must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous act. Otherwise, the event would not merit that appellation. Basically, he's saying, okay, so natural law means everything occurs the same way at all times and all places. Therefore, there's a uniform movement of the world. Okay, water never becomes wine. We know this because we've never experienced water becoming wine. A miracle is by definition a change. So if we've never seen water become wine, we see and claim that Christ has made water into wine. It deserves the claim that it is miraculous, the miraculous appellation, that is just to call it a miracle, because it goes against everything we've ever experienced of natural law. However, Hume says that as a uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact against the existence of any miracles. So he's saying, look, because at all times and all places water never becomes wine, and the definition of a miracle is an exception to this universally otherwise statement, that is proof. If there has never been an occurrence of it except this one, why would we think that this violates the law? So he says that the uniform experience of nature itself is the proof against miracles. And further, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So he's saying you should never actually believe someone saying that there is a miracle, because the amount of evidence they would need to be produced is beyond their ability to do. So we should never trust, according to Hume, any reports of miracles. So this is a rather rough critique, and it would go against Hume's or Locke's entire understanding of something that is above reason. Now, I won't fully refute this argument today. I want to make sure that you know it is refutable. We do not have to hold to these laws of nature in the same way that Hume did, and that the ability of testimony to tell us about something other than which we've experienced is actually the uniform nature of testimony. All testimony of the past or historical events, for instance, is a statement about things that could never have been otherwise. They're unique. And if we're to reject all testimony about unique events, we have to reject the entire past. I would recommend that you look into this. Dr. Collins has actually written a book, The God of Miracles, who digs into this very deeply, as well as C.S. Lewis's work on miracles, both of which are very good. This critique against miracles, you see, undercuts the attempts to preserve this rationalist religion that still keeps hold of many of the elements of Christianity. These ideas will be taken even further by Gotthold Lessing, who was a German philosopher, poet, and playwright. But he extends it not just to the miraculous, but to all of history being unable to show the truths of revealed religion. He says, if no historical truth can be demonstrated, then nothing can be demonstrated by means of historical truth. That is, the accidental truths of history can never become the proof of necessary truths of reason. That then is the ugly broad ditch which I cannot get over, however often and however earnestly I have tried to make the leap. He presents this on his refutation of the idea that Christianity is proved, as the Apostle Paul says, by the Spirit and power. Lessing is complaining that had I been there, had I seen Christ, had I seen Christ perform miracles, I would believe. But all I have to go on is historical testimony, and this historical testimony is never enough to establish what he understands as necessary truths of reason. So we see already he slipped in the definition of certainty here from the rationalist and empiricist mode. The only way to know something at all is to have it before your eyes, to be a necessary truth of reason. Anything less than a necessary truth cannot be established, and that is what one seeks in this rational religious mode. Okay? History, according to Lessing, cannot produce complete certainty. Okay? The response that one would have to this is one doesn't actually need the certainty that Lessing is describing. The sort of certainty he is seeking is very much the Cartesian certainty that we should only be certain about things that which we could not rationally doubt in any way. However, when you work through that list of things, it becomes extremely small. In most of everyday life, one cannot have certainty about things that we are, at least in everyday experience, quite certain of. So this can be overcome in various other ways, and I refer you to Dr. Collins and C.S. Lewis for that. But the main point here is that many Enlightenment thinkers, building upon the Newtonian worldview of a closed system and the thought established within the early period of Enlightenment, the Empiricism and the Rationalism, thought of the world as a closed system that therefore excluded the possibility of divine action in space and time altogether. Again, we've moved to this idea of anti-supernaturalism or a naturalism. The world that we experience and our knowledge of it is only that of particles of matter in motion. And there is no external force in the world that might change them or even necessarily uphold them for some of these figures. So this is quite a radical break from the understanding of Christianity within the medieval and early modern worlds, in which we still have a very much active God, we have providence, we have the truths of revelation. But without revelation and the elevating of reason above it, we begin to break down some of the most basic truths of Christianity, even though some of the earlier figures like Locke tried to preserve a place for them. These later ideas close off that option within Locke's thought especially. This reconceptualization of the world, God, and the possibility of revelation affected anthropology as well. So what does it mean to be a human person? It has changed our place in the world. And this is combined with a general rejection of original sin by all of these Enlightenment figures, that human capacity is not limited, either really by our finiteness or by our fallenness, that human reason can reach out and grasp the highest truths of the world. And sin does not really hold us back. In some ways, we can think of this as the birth of what we would call Promethean man. We see an image of Prometheus to my left. Prometheus was a hero of Greek antiquity who stole fire from the gods and brought it back to humanity, and for that he was crushed by the gods. But in some ways, this daring to know that we saw from Kant is giving a new view of the human person, devoid of the stain of sin, living in a world of motion and matter. And this is going to have profound effects on how one understands individual persons and how we understand society, which is the collection of individual persons. And these ideas are still very much in vogue today and have various effects that I can't go into. But some of this you will probably see as I describe it. One of the most important discussions of this new human condition comes with a debate between, they didn't actually debate, but a literary debate and a philosophical difference between Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher who generally spent most of his time in Geneva. They both propose different understandings of humanity in the state of nature. Okay, so we've moved from creation to nature. What does it mean for natural man? Because whatever is natural to man in Enlightenment thinking is the good of man. Okay, so whatever is our nature therefore produces our good. And then one must have to think, what is the natural state of man? What is going on here? Okay, in Christianity, the natural state of man is being in the image of God and perfect union with the Creator. That's what Eden was all about. So in some ways, what these thinkers are doing is trying to create a secular Eden. Okay, we can't have that, they would say. This is revealed truth. What can we discern by reason about the natural state of humanity? And therefore, from that, discern what is the good of humanity and how are they to collectively relate to one another, or political or social thought. Okay, so Rousseau says that human beings in their natural state are good. Okay? This is connected to ideas of this time of the noble savage. So those who are removed from the state of society are living peacefully in union with nature and have a deep kind of movement into the world. Okay? This is also comes up in other thought as well. But so in Rousseau's understanding, human fundamental nature is good. There is no original sin. He said there is no perversity in human nature. Rather, it is what is external to us, society and civilization, that corrupt good human beings. His famous quote that opens up his work on the social contract is that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Therefore, the construction of society must be a radical democracy. Rousseau argued for a direct democracy of all people under equality. Okay? We'll see some of these ideas brought to fruition in the French Revolution. Hobbes, on the other hand, who thought before Rousseau, argued the fundamental opposite. Humanity in its natural state, according to Hobbes, is self-interested. And therefore, what the natural state of man is a war of all against all. Okay, so if there is no society in our natural state before the kind of the building of human institutions, according to Hobbes, all we have is the will to power. Everyone has equal claim on everything, and the only way to secure your claim is that of power and violence. And so the natural state of man, according to Hobbes, out of our self-interested and in some ways evil nature, is to wage war against all. And this makes man in his natural life so he says this, it's a famous quote, "The life of man in his natural state, should be noted, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Therefore, in order to overcome this natural state of human self-interest, Hobbes endorses a extremely strong state to control the impulses of humanity and bring order. So in both of these thoughts, we have how do human beings come to proper flourishing? If we have that question, we have to ask what sort of thing is a human being? What is a human being's nature? Rousseau argues that a human being, by being good, needs to have all constraints that corrupt him removed. So society must be completely reordered, right? This idea of democracy in the 18th century is extremely radical. There exists no democracy at this time except America, which isn't even a full democracy. It's a representational democracy. But Rousseau's ideas call for a complete reconstruction of all social institutions and the removal of all things that will limit the individual from expressing their good. Hobbes sees it the other way. Human beings are going to naturally come into conflict and increasing conflict over various things. Therefore, there must be a superstructure or a state in order to contain the person. These ideas will have profound implications on political thought and social organization throughout the 19th and 20th century. And how does this connect to Christianity? It changes the fundamental human problem. Okay? No longer are human beings created in the image of God and yet in rebellion and sin who need redemption and a savior. But we have two options. Either humanity needs the animal instincts directed by society. So our base animal instincts must be directed by a larger whole, a power of a state to control the individual. And this path would be taken by what are generally called Enlightenment despotism or absolute monarchies. Or on Rousseau's count, human beings have innate goodness, and therefore it needs to be free from all constraints of society, except that which one freely enters into. This will be one of the basis of his understandings of social contract theory. Therefore, in both of these new views of humanity, disconnected from the relationship to God, disconnected from revealed morality, the function of politics becomes the place of human redemption. So redemption is no longer the redemption of sin and the hope of glory in another life, as the scriptures reveal, but human redemption happens in this world through the exercise of thought and experience. And so the politics are the way to free people from either their animalistic instincts or the oppression of current society as Rousseau saw it. Therefore, there is this understanding of progress that through the implementation of human reason, through the implementation of rational scientific thought, that human society will continually move closer and closer to the ideal, or what is generally called utopia. Okay, perfect ordering and human flourishing of all society. And this will be one of the main impulses between some of the most radical political movements within the 19th through the 20th century. Okay, so we've seen in the 18th century, building up upon the shift in Newtonian Copernican science and the earlier thought of rationalism and empiricism, three moves that have fundamentally changed the nature of Christianity. We've seen the reformulation of the doctrine of God in the thought of the deists who remove God's action from the world, moving in a very naturalist mode, rejecting the acts of the supernatural. We've seen this even further in the rejection of miracles and the possibility of history to establish the truths of reason, which are defined there as the truths of religion as well. And we've seen this reconfiguration of human persons and the society. So throughout much of this thought, religion is being reordered. It must be in conformity with human reason, which is autonomous, which can reject everything of tradition and revelation. And its highest expression is generally going to be some sort of basic rational morality. That is the essence of human religion expressed by most of these deists. Okay? So the ideas of the Enlightenment would challenge every basic aspect of the Christian faith. The Trinity would be called into question, the Incarnation, sin, redemption, the need of grace, faith, and the second coming. All of these become suspect as they are the result of trusting the revealed will of God and not submitting it to the autonomous activity of human reason and thought. This is not to dare to know. This is not to rely on reason alone, but to bow before what Kant would call an immature faith. Throughout most of the 18th century, this must be noted, these ideas were largely confined to elite intellectual circles, whether in England, Paris, or Germany. However, they would filter down over time to the common people. Okay, so remember, at the same time, as all these Enlightenment ideas are going on that are questioning all the elements of Christianity, we have one of the biggest revivals happening at the same time amongst the common people, who are responding to the same needs, the needs for certainty, the needs for hope, the needs for relieving from the suffering of this world. They saw it coming through the message of the gospel. And the Enlightenment saw it coming through the exercise of human reason. One of the examples of these ideas filtering down into the common man and changing society is that of the American Revolution, which built off many of the ideas expressed in the Enlightenment, especially some of the Lockean forms, such as religious toleration, balances of power, so the three forms of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial were part of the Enlightenment idea of checks and balances. We have movements of thought from Rousseau, the securing of social contract elements, and this would very much affect the American Revolution. However, it's also combined with certain forms of Puritan thought, so these can kind of go together. Most of the signers of the Declaration and the delegates at the Continental Congress would be deists, however. We get a more radical expression of the Enlightenment, though, not in the American Revolution, but in the French Revolution, which is often seen as paradigmatic or emblematic of the kind of Enlightenment project and the shift to what we call modernity or the modern world. So the French Revolution and the later French Republic, which lasts from 1789 to 1799, which will end with the rise of Napoleon and the return to what he sees as an enlightened empire, would stem from the political, social, and philosophical ideas that we've already seen in the Enlightenment. The imposing of reason and empirical studies on the ordering of society, especially political society, the rejection of traditional authority, and this form of deism will all be extremely important in the French Revolution. So the revolution began, I can't get into all the history of this, I would recommend you read up on it if you do. The French Revolution is extremely important. But its basic idea was the overthrow of the overreach of power and privilege of King Louis XVI and the aristocracy of what is called the ancien regime. That's just the ancient regime, the regime before the revolution, which is what it's normally called. This is an attempt by the people, especially the middle class and some of the lower nobility, to overturn what was seen as corruption. However, the revolution unleashes forces that kind of speed through the nation and cause very drastic changes. The act that kind of marks the revolution, there's already been a Congress called the Third Estate for various reasons in 1789, but there's the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, which is the opening kind of shots of the revolution that will then develop over many years. And the calls of the revolution are very much of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, and fraternity. That human beings are made to be free, very much in the Rousseauian understanding, and everything that stops their freedom must be removed. The human beings are equal before the law, and therefore all privilege needs to be taken away. And that can be in various levels of radical equality of worth or equality of outcome can both be seen within the French Revolution. And fraternity, the unity of the human beings under reason. The French Revolution took a very radical turn with the rise of the Jacobin Party in 1793, and this is seen as a very important move here. The Jacobins ushered in what was known as the Terror in order to bring the population in line with the ideals of the revolution. And in this, over 10,000 people were executed by the guillotine, which you might think of the guillotine as primarily a barbaric idea, but it was actually a product of the scientific and Enlightenment thinking. The guillotine was seen as the most efficient and humane way of execution, and therefore became emblematic, actually, of Enlightenment reasoned thinking about how to execute. This terror was an attempt to fulfill the revolution, to remove all reactionary thought against the revolution and bring about this utopia. This often is seen to exemplify the possible darker side of the Enlightenment, and is often referred back to by anti-Enlightenment thinkers throughout the 19th and 20th century as an exhibition of the danger of this sort of revolutionarist mentality. In some ways, we can see this bringing to fruition a statement of Rousseau from his work, The Social Contract. Now, this is not what he necessarily meant by it, but some of the ideas were used to support it. He says, in order that the social compact may not be an empty formula, It tacitly includes the understanding, which alone can give force to the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Okay, so this idea leads to many different acts throughout the 19th and 20th century of the idea of forcing reactionaries, those who oppose revolutionary ideas, forcing them to be free or removing them from the society by the general will. The terror reveals a fairly common modern idea that the ends justify the means. So if the ends are good, if the goal is a purely just society, whatever means one needs to get there is required and even necessary. Okay, this will be kind of to unleash new political forces throughout the world that will move throughout the 19th century, which is often seen as a series of various revolutions throughout the world. More important for our own understanding is that the Jacobins followed a plan which was known as de-Christianization. So while the earlier part of the revolution sought to push back some of the corruption of the church and various elements, because you have to remember France, the Catholic Church was probably the most powerful institution next to the monarchy. And the Jacobins thought to deconstruct this power and therefore make way for the Enlightenment to move to all people. They've therefore confiscated church lands. 30,000 priests were exiled and many were killed. Even the Christian calendar was reset. We move from AD, the year of the Lord, to a new calendar beginning with the year of the Revolution. So even time itself is reconstructed by the French revolutionaries to focus on human enlightenment and not Christianity. They don't only reorder the days of the year, but even reorder the week, removing the Sabbath. So it's no longer a 7-day week, but a 10-day week, which reorders all of human society under what was understood to be a rational scheme. Okay, you can see how people thought, well, 7 is an irrational way to organize our weeks, therefore we will organize them around 10, the kind of normal unit of counting. And so all of this is reshaping society, and it's going quite far and quite radically. We see this further emphasis on de-Christianization in two new religions that were instituted. These were in somewhat competition. One was an atheistic cult of reason. So no deity, but reason itself was exemplified and worshipped. Noel brings up the story that this is very prominently displayed of the radical shift from a predominantly Catholic country to this elevation of reason, in that there is a parade called the Festival of Reason, in which a female opera singer, or some accounts that probably aren't true, say a prostitute, but this is kind of what this shaming of the Catholic Church is brought to Notre Dame, and there's a festival to reason. And they're being extremely disrespectful and clever here, because Notre Dame means Our Lady. So Notre Dame is dedicated to Mary. And so there's the shift here from Our Lady being Mary in the Catholic Church to Our Lady being Lady Reason and the Lady of the Revolution in France. There's also a deistic cult that was supported by Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobins, until he himself is guillotined in 1794. And this is the cult of the Supreme Being, which is primarily a deist cult. But what we see in the French Revolution, although this is only a short period of time, is this radical de-Christianization is telling us about the winds of change that are going to be happening in Europe that have been brought about by the Enlightenment. I think we can express this well as the French Revolution expresses the beginning of the end of Christendom that will unravel throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Noel puts it this way: the Enlightenment ideas brought the end of Christendom, to the end of the lengthy period of European history when the interests of the church and the society were thought to be the same, and where it was almost universally assumed that Christian spiritual realities were more fundamental than realities of the temporal world. I think Noel is very correct here. What we see in the French Revolution is the overturning of the old unity between church, society, and nation. We now have the ability to have the church opposed by the state, and the state opposing the church, removing the clergy, and instituting actually a new rational faith. And we have a change in circumstance from Christendom, or the pre-modern world in which Christian realities, the supernatural, the truth of God, the ability of God to act in the world, was unquestioned, to a new state where these things had to be argued for. Emphasis moves from contemplating one's state in the future world, relationships to God, patient endurance of suffering, to focus purely on the temporal world, and to many a denial of another world or another element of reality itself. The second Christianity must defend the truth of its own revelation, we have moved out of Christendom. It is now being called into question. And so in that sense, this new position in which Christianity is no longer the default, no longer universally respected and accepted as true, even if one didn't really follow it to a T, one didn't deny its truths or respect for the Bible. We move into a new era. This is often called modernity, a new state of human engagement. So, as well as being the symbolic end of the beginning of the end of Christendom, the French Revolution is the beginning of this concept of modernity itself. So that word is used in lots of different ways. So I'm trying to use it as a marker of a period, much as we talked about before. So modernity, as I'm using it, describes the changed conditions brought about by the intellectual, social, and economic ideas, etc., and conditions coming from the 18th to 19th century. So modernity is a new way of the world being constructed, being thought about, new forces, new ideas, and it fundamentally reshaped the way people understood themselves, God, society, and the world. So I'm going to talk about some of the basic characteristics of modernity. This is a very tricky term, and scholars still debate. Some of the stuff I read for this gave 15 or 16 different attempts to explain what is the essence of modernity. I think we can understand it more or less as a combination of factors, a changing view of the world that is anti-supernatural, no engagement with God or the supernatural ideas, and focus much more on the individual and hope of progress in the temporal world as the main goal of human activity and society. So I want us to give a couple characteristics that more or less would explain modernity. I should again stress that modernity comes in varied ways, in different places and different times. So there is no one modernity, there are modernities, but they can share similar characteristics. One of these is a disenchantment of the world. That is the loss of sacred and metaphysical understanding of all facets of life and culture. So as we've said before, pre-modern man, regardless of culture, really understood the world as charged with spiritual reality and meaning. That the world could be understood in a metaphysical way, having a directedness towards God. Providence reigned in all of life. With modernity, the world becomes something else. It becomes either a mechanism or merely, as I've said before, matter in motion. And this means that everyday life is in some ways removed from its enchantment, removed from its ultimate significance, and therefore humanity must seek it in new ways. And we'll see various attempts to do that throughout the modern period. So the world moves from an enchanted place with God reigning over, with angels, with spiritual forces, with meaning, with providence, with miracles, to a world of matter in motion. And this is not just something people think, but this affects how they actually experience the world. Think about the difference of looking at a sunrise. And what are the conceptions we use? Is this showing forth the glory of God in his ordering of creation? Or is this merely showing us the prismatic separation of light in the atmosphere of a distant burning ball? These are very different things. And how do we understand them on the deep level? So modernism is generally connected with this disenchantment of the world. It's also connected with rationalism, that the world can be understood and managed through a reasonable and logical system of objectively accessible theories and data. So we've already seen this put forward in the relationship of rationalism and empiricism. This attempt to rationalize all of society comes about very much in modernity. And this has good elements and bad elements. But every part of human society is meant to fulfill the requirements of reason. In some areas of society, such as science, such as engineering, this is a very good thing. However, the rationalization of human activity can lead to very negative effects. These ideas, the disenchantment of the world and rationalism, also lead to secularization, the loss of religious influence or religious belief at the societal level. So in much of modernity, the society is seen as religiously neutral, and religious belief is a personal affair that is not to affect one's public life. This is always kind of connected to this idea of modernity, the separation of church and state, and in some ways to religious toleration. We'll see why this idea becomes a mark of modernity with the shift in liberal Christian theology that we'll see in a moment. In addition to these three characteristics of disenchantment, rationalization, and secularization, we also have different understandings of the human person and the nature of history itself. So there is a strong emphasis on individualism, growing stress on the individual as opposed to the mediating structures of society, such as the family, clan, academy, village, or church. The fundamental unit of human society in modernity is that of the autonomous individual, who is what makes up a family, a state, a nation, a movement, etc. In this, it's a fundamental change from how human beings were thought of before in some ways, that human beings were embedded. You were first a member of a family and then an individual second. Your allegiance was not primarily to yourself, but to your people, to your religion, to your church. But modernity focuses much more on the granular. The individual is the main unit of society. In some ways, in the thought of modernity, the individual precedes all of the larger mediating structures of meaning and authority that we see within the church. And this will have an effect on religion. Religion becomes very much an individual affair. We've already seen some of that in the Pietism and the Awakening. So it's moving from a similar idea as the Enlightenment. This will continue to be the case in most modern forms of Christianity. So this individualism downplays the position of authority, downplays the position of accountability, downplays the collective meaning of the church global. And in addition to this change of understanding the world, there's a difference in understanding history and the future. So the idea of progress that we mentioned before becomes a defining mark of modernity, that inevitably social, scientific, and technological advancements will come about. The world will continue to get better and better. And this is because human society and even the human person is perfectible by human reason. So without the need to account for original sin and the fallenness of human beings, modernity stresses that through the implementation of reason and experience and later emotional attachment, all of society can be changed into a utopia, and that everything that we do societally, scientifically, and technologically will move us closer and closer to human flourishing. Okay, this was a very prominent idea in the 19th century and marks out modernity a lot. You can see this very much as a secular eschatology, that the world through human endeavor will continue and move into a perfection of itself. Okay, so this elements of modernity and the Enlightenment have many effects on our common day that I think you can probably see. I want to briefly talk about some of the one of the main Christian responses to this that was influential in the subsequent period. Okay, the Christian response to the Enlightenment were varied and would be an ongoing project of the church for the next centuries. Okay, so there are many different ways that Christianity responded to the Enlightenment, and we'll talk about some of them later in the class. The main activity of most conservative and Orthodox Christians was to seek to reject the autonomy of reason and secure the authority of revelation. See, because this is where all these problems for Christianity stem from in the Enlightenment, the rejection of the authority of revelation to give us truth and the reliance on human reason. So most Orthodox and conservative theologians would focus on securing the truth of Scripture. Another response, however, will form the basis for Protestant liberalism, typified by the German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's often called the father of modern liberal theology. So Schleiermacher takes a very different take to the response to the Enlightenment, and this is going to create what we'll understand as a new strand of Christianity. So we'll have the older pre-modern Christianity continue in response to modernity, reaffirm the basic orthodox truths of Christianity and try to express them as clearly and as persuasively as possible. We'll see this throughout many of the conservative theologians later on. Schleiermacher takes another path and creates a new idea. And you can see kind of his understanding from his early work on this called Religion, Speeches to its Cultured Despisers. So in some ways, Schleiermacher is trying to make Christianity acceptable to rational modern people. And he does this, though, by reorienting his tradition. One of his most important other works is called The Christian Faith, which is his dogmatics, written in 1830 to 1831. And it's a very interesting work. It's got some interesting elements to it, but ultimately it's going to form the basis for what we know as liberal theology. So Schleiermacher offered a new foundation for the Christian religion and theology. It is now based upon religious experience and feeling. Okay, take feeling not as emotion per se, but intuition, intuitive movement towards the world, and this new faculty of religious experience. So by placing this religion on this foundation, Schleiermacher sought to make Christianity immune from the rational attacks that had been putting forward. So to remove it from the sphere in which the cultured despisers could attack it with reason and empiricism. In this, his main idea is what is called the feeling of absolute dependence. This is the nature of faith and religion. He says it this way in his later systematic work. The common element in all diverse expressions of piety, which is the essence of all Christianity for Schleiermacher, by which there are conjointly distinguished from all other feelings, is, in other words, the self-identical essence of piety is this: the consciousness of absolute dependence, or which is the same thing, of being in relation with God. In this, Schleiermacher is really turning Christianity on its head, rather being the response to an objective revelation that comes from without. Christianity becomes the subjective experience of within of a feeling of absolute dependence that becomes relationship to God. Okay, so Christian faith is the reflection on our internal experience that then is expressed in doctrines. These doctrines are not necessarily attempting to describe the objective world, but are derived from the feelings within. Now, again, it's more complicated than this, and I could recommend books that explain Schleiermacher more fully. But this shift has a profound effect. It moves Christianity from an objective response to divine revelation to a reflection upon subjective experience of the divine to explain the world. So in this, faith becomes the feeling of absolute dependence, more generically. Therefore, Christ becomes the exemplar of this feeling. Christ is God in the sense for Schleiermacher in that he exhibits the highest God consciousness. He experienced the highest level possible of absolute dependence on the divine, and therefore is our exemplar. Notice here that there is no real purpose of the cross to achieve salvation. The cross becomes the example, and it's meant to invoke the feeling that God has acted towards us. So it does not objectively save us, but is an exemplary mode of the nature of God. And this will have many effects throughout theology. So Christ becomes merely the exemplar of this feeling of absolute dependence. The Bible then also becomes not an objective source of revelation to know God, but a collection of various and even contradictory religious experiences across time that we can draw for inspiration, but does not have the authority. Okay, this interior and subjective understanding of theology would be extremely influential throughout Europe and America, and would be the foundation for the many strands of liberal theology that conservative and orthodox theologians who reject these claims and hold to the authority and objectivity of reason, revelation over reason, will continually brush up against even to this day. All right, we've gone through a lot today. We've looked at a lot of the different trends that inform the religious understanding and intellectual understanding of the 17th and 18th century to which Christianity will respond. Now I want us to end with just a brief assessment, going back to these ideas I discussed at the beginning. How are we to understand the Enlightenment? What are we to make of this? Are we to embrace it entirely? Are we to reject it entirely? I would argue that neither of those is a wise choice for almost anything. But we do need to make sure we accept and praise the contributions that the Enlightenment did make. It did not make these alone, but the Enlightenment contributed to many things that Christians ought to appreciate and support for our own reasons. It contributed to the concept of religious toleration, which we think should be good. There is no compunction in religion, and therefore the state should not force the religion on the people. And this is very helpful for Christians in our own day. It contributed to the understanding of democracy, which may be one of the best ways to organize society. It contributed to human equality, which is also a Christian commitment, since all are made in the image of God. And it contributed to things such as the rule of law. There are many others. Enlightenment thought did contribute, along with other ideas, to improvements in the modern world, to the flourishing of human people. And many of the applications of reason and experience, rational methodology, beyond religion, the Christian church should certainly affirm and commit themselves to as well, as long as one doesn't slip into the naturalism that they presuppose. However, there are other things that the Enlightenment contributed to that challenge the very heart of the Christian faith and ought to be rejected, such as naturalism, the removal of the acts of God from the world, the rejection of miracles, the rejection of the ability of revelation to even be. We must reject the nature of autonomous reason. Christians reason under the authority of the scriptures and in the constant conversation with the traditions of the church that are meant to inform us. We are all fallen. No human person can reason his way to God, but we must submit ourselves to the word. So as one of the central planks of the Enlightenment, the autonomous nature, or not needing to be controlled by any other nature of human reason, must be rejected. And likewise, we must push against the extreme individualism of the Enlightenment, but rather see the emphasis on society as a whole, humanity as a whole, and the commitment to a communal understanding of God and his people through ideas such as the covenant, etc. So there are many other ideas that Christianity must challenge. But I want us to have this more complex narrative in which the Enlightenment does bring many good things into the world that we can celebrate for Christian reasons, and yet there are many other things that challenge the church, and that the church will have to work out as it goes forward. We'll pick up some of these ideas next time as we continue our engagement into the history of Christianity in America with what is called the Second Great Awakening. We'll look at this movement, how it changed the fundamental makeup of American Christianity, and we'll also look at several other developments of the era of the early 19th century and how they affected the church even up to our own day.